very rapidly, it seems like, to me. You know, in our country, we have two different kinds of holidays. We have religious holidays and we have national holidays. Religious holidays, Christmas, Easter. National holidays, of course, President's Day and Memorial Day and Independence Day. My question is, what kind of a holiday is Thanksgiving? What would your guess be? It's actually a national holiday. It's not a religious holiday, but it has more religious overtones than probably any holiday right now. Of course, it frustrates me a little when people want to give thanks, but they don't direct it to anyone. To me, it's kind of like, well, who are you thanking? Your lucky stars? Or, I mean, you just kind of throw out, you know, people need to be grateful, but grateful to who? Well, that's where, you know, I think the Christian has an advantage. We know the target. Our thankfulness, our gratitude is to God. Now that was free. That really didn't have anything to do with the sermon of the day, but when you mention holidays, I got to think, is it that time already? We have been going through some of the minor prophets. And if you've forgotten what defines a minor prophet, simply the length of the book. That's really it. We have prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah who wrote lengthy books. And then we have guys like Micah, Haggai, Zephaniah, Zechariah, Malachi, that wrote short books. Well, today I want to focus your attention on the minor prophet of Micah. So if you would turn to that book in your Bible, it's towards the latter part of the Old Testament. Context is important. And so to know when a prophet wrote and what was going on around him, I think is very important because it helps us understand what his motives were, what his intentions were, what God was directing him to say. And so let's take just a minor look here. If you look at the very first verse of chapter 1, you'll find out the context. The word of the Lord came to Micah during the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Now, when did they reign? Well, we spent a lot of time talking about the Babylonian captivity, where Israel was carried off into Babylon. We just got through talking about 70 years later when they were coming back. Ezra, you know, and Nehemiah and those guys that came back to rebuild. But Micah actually is at the beginning, before Babylon hauled those people off. Reason I know that, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah reigned. They were some of the last kings to reign. Now you recall that the nation of Israel had wanted a king. They begged for one. God put Saul in as king, and then later David, then Solomon. That was for what we call the United Kingdom that ruled the whole Israel nation. But then the nation split. Northern 10 tribes made up what was referred to as Israel. The lower two tribes were referred to as Judah. And these kings were of Judah. Now, were they good or bad? Well, combination. Some of you will remember Ahaz, probably even remember his wife's name even more. We remember his wife's name even though nobody names their little girls that anymore. Did you know that? And it's for the same reason that most don't name their little boys Adolf. She was her name is synonymous, Jezebel. That's who she was. Ahaz really wasn't much better, but if anything, I would say Jezebel took the case. They were so intent on doing away with prophets that you remember Elijah had to run for his life and hide out away from them. But now Hezekiah, on the other hand, was kind of a mix. He was faithful to God, but he also had his weak times. But that's the beginning of this time that we refer to as the Babylonian captivity. Now, what was Micah's message? Well, it's not unlike some of the other messages. The fact that Israel and Judah needed to straighten up. The whole reason for the prophets, they were the preachers of the day, and they were there to basically instruct, correct. Sometimes they got pretty direct, sometimes pretty creative, some tact involved. But the idea was they needed to return to God. Now the question is, how do you do that? Was it really a mystery? Today I want to focus on what I would consider one of the key verses of the book. I'm not doing a full exegesis of the whole passage. I want you to turn to the 6th chapter. Many of you will recognize this verse. You know, if someone expects you to do a job, it's really helpful if you knew what that job was. And some bosses are pretty clear and specific, and some are not. Now, I mentioned that, years ago I started out working at Joplin Stockyards, and I worked for two different guys, one in the horse business, one in the cow business. And one was very organized, very methodical. You're going to sort a bunch of cattle, he would point to you and name a number, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and grab a gate. And he would head cattle down one at a time, and if he nailed your number, you open the gate. It was pretty simple. Even a college boy like me could follow that. And then on the other hand, the Audios was very good to me, and I appreciated him greatly, but he would always expect you to know what he was thinking. He'd say, well, go get so-and-so's horses. And I'm thinking, well, who's so-and-so? And I don't know where the horses are. I just worked, part-time. And he would say, go in there and put a halter on that horse, and then all the time he'd yell, you'll get kicked, but he never told me how to not get kicked. And so one was more methodical than the other. What kind of a direction does God give? Well, if you'll turn to the 8th verse of chapter 6. In light of all he said, and by the way, I would encourage you to go home and read this book. You can read it in one sitting, even if you're a slow reader like I am. He said in verse 8, he's shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? And he's going to tell them 3 things. Number 1, to act justly. Number 2, to love mercy. And number 3, to walk humbly with your God. Now, let's deal with those one at a time. What does it mean to act justly? It's important for us to know that Isaiah, and there's several verses that refer to justice in the Bible, but in chapter 30 and verse 18, let me read that verse. Yet the Lord longs to be gracious to you. Therefore he will rise up to show you compassion. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all who wait for him. See, justice is actually a part of God's nature. It is a part that sometimes we don't emphasize maybe enough. We talk about God's love, and in that very verse it talked about God's compassion. God is loving. He is compassionate. But he's also a God of justice. What is justice? We all recognize when something unjust occurs to us, Matter of fact, it's part of our DNA in lots of ways. Little kids will say, when another kid takes away their toy, what do they say? It's not fair. It's violated their sense of justice. Anybody deny that? It seems to be inherent with us. We recognize when things are unjust. But here he says that those that would please God need to act justly. Well, how do you do that? What does that mean? It means that to be pleasing to God, you're not to be a crook. It's not just that you're not to break the big laws. It's you're not to do things that are dishonest. You're not to deceive. You're not to take advantage. The reason for government in the first place is to protect the weak from the strong. That is basically the function. And so when he says act justly, there are lots of examples. He doesn't like two different scales or putting your thumb on the scale, so to speak. They used to joke about the butchers, when they'd weigh up the meat, they'd put their thumb on the scale and they'd get another pound or so out of it. I don't know if that actually happened or not. Maybe a good story. Unfortunately, might have been true in some cases. Christians are not to be like the rest of the world. There are some that justify that kind of thing because I had a guy tell me flat out, he says, you can't be honest in today's world and make a go of it. Well, if that's true, how important is it to make a go of it? We think, we have to. But the man of God is not to be unjust in any regard. And so he says, men that are pleasing to God, act justly. Now what else? Love mercy. What do you love? Again, our culture and our language even kind of limits us because we use that word to cover a lot of different bases. Jane loves her dog. Some of you might I love my easy chair. Somebody said this morning when they put out goodies out there that you were doing good till they put out the chocolate. Well, I love chocolate too. But I also love my wife. I love my kids. Same word. It's not the same. It's not. Matter of fact, in Greek, there are 5 different words. And then it comes to God. It's, well, how do we love God? And more importantly, how does God love us? But he says to love mercy. Mercy is to emotion what grace is to sin. Y'all know what grace is. It's when God provides a way for us. Matter of fact, some have made an acrostic of it. God's redemption at Christ's expense. That's spell grace. Did I do it right? What's mercy? Mercy is God's pitiful look on us. He loves us. He's like that puppy by the side of the road in the driving rain that's looking for someone to pick him up, someone to bring him home, someone to feed him. And so what do? You look at that animal with mercy. By the way, in our culture today, puppies get, some cases, more mercy than we show to people. Because people are so disgusting. People are so frustrating. People are people. I know I am one. And so sometimes it's not easy for us to love mercy. But here's why we do love it. God shows it to me. And I like that part a lot. We talked in Sunday school today about the tools that are working against us. Satan is working against us, and he tries to convince us that we are not worthy of God's grace or his mercy. And so sometimes it's hard for us to realize the importance of loving mercy, because mercy does not just mean we love the puppy that looks cute in the rain, but we love the neighbor that annoys us. The person that can't wait to crowd in front of us in the line. People sometimes are annoying. I've told you about what our office boy used to say when I was at Goodman years ago. Say, people, they're the worst kind. Well, they are. Doesn't mean that they're worse than I am. It just means that people are not perfect. If they were, Christ would have had to come. He wouldn't have had to die. So we are to love mercy. Now, what else will we do? Well, we're to walk humbly with our God. What is humility anyway? We have talked about it a little bit. Some have described humility as, well, it's self-abasement. It's when you talk yourself down instead of talking yourself up. Is that what humility is? The best definition I've heard is humility is not thinking of yourself as more important than you are, but neither is it thinking of yourself as less. Humility is not thinking of yourself. When Jesus came to earth, who was he thinking of? Was he thinking that, this is going to be a good experience. I'm going to see how the little people live. I'm going to experience what they experience. Was that what he was thinking? I don't think so. I think, again, in his effort to be just, he realized that there needed to be a price paid because there was a debt owed. That makes sense, doesn't it? If you owe a debt, somebody needs to pay the debt. Now, what if you can't? Well, makes you appreciate the one that can and is willing to. What about mercy? Christ came because he recognized the need that we have for his mercy. So, he didn't come thinking about what it was going to do for him. He came thinking about what it would do for us. And in the process, he gave us the perfect example of humility. I mentioned, I think, to you before, there are several people in the world that I do respect greatly. One of them's name is Alan Nemo, and maybe you have heard of him. He was a missionary to the black tie people, just like Derek Barnes. Different locations, same people group. He's a common guy. Even though he's had his house blown up and escaped, his family did, thank God. But he is a common person, and I remember one time he visited College Heights. We were a congregation that supported him at that time, and he came to a small group. I can't even remember the reason for the group, but it was in one of the classrooms, and it had a bunch of desks. But there were some little chairs for little kids. This seems like a small thing, but when Alan came in, and he was to be the speaker, where do you think he sat? And when he did, I thought, well, how poetic that is. He sat in the little chair. Why? He's not an assuming guy. It was natural for him, There were chairs, but he figured, well, nobody will sit in those little chairs, but he didn't. It didn't bother him, so he did. He sat in a little chair. And I thought, well, that's kind of an example of the way he really is. He's humble. Now, why is that important? We have scriptures that tell us that God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. You want God to look favorably on you? Humility is the way to do it. God really he loves paradoxes. He says, you know, if you want to be first in my kingdom, guess what position you must assume? Last. Well, that doesn't make any sense. If you don't promote yourself, who's going to promote you? Well, in the case of God's kingdom, God does. And he's looking for certain qualities. And one of those qualities is humility. Because he resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Jesus, of course, was the perfect example of that, but there are others throughout Scripture. And there's examples of the converse. The sons of thunder, James and John. Yeah. Their mother came to Jesus. You remember what she wanted? She wanted him to have the vice president and lieutenant governor position or something. She wanted her to be 1 and 2 in his kingdom. When you come in your kingdom, make my sons your 1 and 2 people. So Jesus asked the question, can they handle that? Oh yeah, we can. No problem. But they didn't know what they were saying. They didn't know what they were getting into. Because you see, Jesus said in front of Pilate, but I think we see it through his entire life, his kingdom wasn't of this world. If it were, when they came to haul him off, his people would have fought. But he told them not to. Why? Because that wasn't what he had in mind. It caused a lot of people of his day not to recognize that he was, in fact, God's promised Messiah, because he didn't fit the mold. They were under the occupation of Rome. They were looking for a Messiah that's going to come and kick Rome out of Palestine. Restore the glory of Solomon. You know, I saw in my reading this week that Solomon was, part of his income was about 25 tons of gold. That's just the gold. Not to mention the silver. And that's just from his, you know, people that are in the realm. They pay their taxes, and that's what went to him. 25 tons of gold. Can you imagine? Now, they wanted the glory of Israel to be restored. And when Jesus came, you remember what he said as he was getting ready to enter Jerusalem on the day of his triumphal entry? You remember that he sat on that donkey and cried? The word, I think, indicates he bawled. Why? Because he looked down at Jerusalem and he knew what was going to happen because of the rejection of him. And he cared for them. He knew what would happen in 70 AD. Matter of fact, he knew what was going to happen to Christians throughout the ages. That they will be persecuted. They're not going to have it easier than the master. He asked the question, do you expect to have it an easier ride than the master? And the answer is, well, no. Well, look what they did to him. They killed him, but they disgraced him before they did that. They tortured him before that. They finally killed him. So what do we expect? Would you be a Christian if you knew? We know that, there's the possibility of persecution. We also know there's the possibility of poverty. But what if you knew that being a Christian was synonymous with never having a place to lay your head? Because that's what Jesus knew. He wouldn't have a home. Some of his property would be the clothes on his back. And those were even taken from him. If we knew that, would we still elect to follow him? Would we? That's a question that probably none of us will know until we're faced with that decision. But Jesus knew it. And he faced it. Why? Because of all these things I just mentioned. He's our example. He was just. He knew that a debt needed to be paid, and we needed it to be paid because of what? Well, because of his compassion, his mercy for us. And we also know that through that whole process, he showed tremendous humility. He could have called for a bunch of angels come in and clean the house. You know, I maybe should admit this, I kind of enjoy Jason Statham movies because, you know, he comes across as, pretty calm and quiet until finally he comes unstrung and, he uses his defensive skills and all that, and he just literally mops the floor with whoever. And there's a part of us that says, yes, get him. As long as I'm not the guy he's getting, that's kind of fun. But Jesus didn't opt to do it that way. That tells me that maybe I need to reorder my priorities, the way I look at things. Maybe I should look at things a little differently, but Jesus had that power. He could have, we think he should have, but really, he did the right thing. Challenge for us today. Why do you think this is written down? Micah lived 1,000 years ago, 700 something, close to that, give or take. Why is it written down? What's written for us? Because you'll be pleasing to God. This is a pretty good outline to follow, don't you think? Now, we look at it from a little different perspective. We look at it from the perspective of a New Testament Christian perspective. Hindsight's 20/20, at least it should be, unless you want to rewrite history. Not that that's not done. But we know what happens when a person becomes a Christian. We understand why Christ came. We look at the entire spectrum of Scripture from creation to the end, from the perspective that God is sovereign over the affairs of men. We know his plan now. And we know that when we're obedient to him, that those are prerequisites as well, but the characteristics that God likes to see in his people, among a few others, but they're basically these: to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. We're going to sing a hymn of invitation. The invitation is really simple. It's basically the same one every week. That is, if you need to make a decision, now's a good time to make it. The decision to postpone is also a decision. Sometimes, I'll make that decision later. Well, then you made a decision to say no. Say no to God.